we're in an election year, right? And so I will get a lot of questions from reporters that will say, what is the most important issue for Black people, right? And it's like how do you even answer that question? And they want you to say criminal justice or something with the economy or voting rights, and they want you to give a specific issue that is some sort of silver bullet issue that can translate back to a poll, and that if a politician then says the right things on it, they then in turn will be seen as doing the right thing on behalf of Black people. And so the part of, I think, what you're doing is complicating that in an era where people don't want things to be complicated.
No, I know. That's a personality flaw of mine. I'm always on the front end of, no, it's not what you think it is, from top to bottom. But what you're saying is so important, because the main mechanism for doing it is one thing. That's a sort of an extension of what I'd call the Southern strategy, right? An articulation of the ever abstraction of the how racism is working until you can't really see it unless you go down into it in a particular way. But the way it hides from us, which is different from the way that it's produced, is that we begin to tell stories that are almost always about individual actors. So racism becomes a behavior, a personal attitude, a way of thinking, but it is not a systemic matter. Why? Because we handled that in the civil rights era. And so by saying that it's illegal to be racist doesn't mean that there's no very limited protection if there is racism. It just means it's not legalized, right? It's not forced apartheid, right? So once that becomes the belief that handled all of the institutional forms of systemic racism that existed, now as long as we keep telling stories in individual ways, we will basically embody this in our behavior. We'll say, yes, we can all agree when those cops in Mississippi do this horrible, heinous form of torture, that's bad. But if you ask how many police forces in the United States practice that kind of behavior, and which ones in major cities with Black people like Chicago have done it for 40 years, now you're having another conversation. So what I did in the second half of the book was say, well, let me tell you 3 stories you think you know. Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and Kelly Williams Bolar, who was the woman in Ohio who was stealing education, so on. So she's the only one who lived, so people don't remember her as much. So we all can agree Trayvon probably shouldn't have been stalked, right? We can kind of agree that Mike Brown wasn't supposed to be killed, but that's a little more ambiguous because of the perception of threat that was activated and the fact that he stole cigarillos. I'm talking about mainstream consciousness. But what's missing from all of it, in the big picture, some journalists did handle one thing at a time, but the whole picture is totally missing. And they were both in an incredible web of systemic racism. When you really dig into it, it's stunning how profound it was. Not just the fact that he was punished, Trayvon was punished in the high school that he should have not been suspended from, but that he was suspended for infractions that do not warrant suspensions. And if you follow his suspensions and it's not in any way following the crop high rules. When you look at the stop and frisk in Miami Gardens where he lived with his mom before he went down to see his dad and got killed by Zimmerman, George, he was in an area where they had one guy who was stopped and frisked 258 times. Okay, the corner store was so frustrated with the police that they turned their surveillance cameras on the police, not on the brothers in the neighborhood, to document the police's behavior, which is why these journalists could find it and see what was happening. So that's what he left. So why would he run from some guy with a gun talking about stop? So that's missing. So there's over and over and over. Mike Brown, I'll tell you one more quick detail that totally, was just stunning to me. So when he was first in the news after the murder, they had pictures of him as a thug drinking a 40 ounce on his social feed. And then they had him with the whole graduation outfit. And he was a happy, cherubic-faced young man. Looked like he was going off to college somewhere. So I said, well, where was he going? Does anybody know where he was going to college? Oh, trade. I wish trade. Trade would be great. That would mean he'd have a trade. Yes, but it was basically a for-profit school called Vatarat. Had 18 campuses around the country. People were being trained in fields that did not exist anymore, accrued incredible debt. Everyone, and you look at the numbers, the government shut them down, but where did they go? Black and Latinx communities. They were saturated in communities where young black people wanted some opportunity and were vulnerable to extending themselves on the myth that these were opportunities when they were just predatory extraction factories. That's all they were. So where was he going? Not where we think he was. Now that, that's just not to say it's better to be dead. That's awful. I don't mean that. I'm saying though this fantasy that, he had a bright future, right? And wouldn't it have been great if this didn't happen? Yes, it would have been great if it didn't happen, but he would have been mired in this process and blamed for it, for sure. Why didn't he pay his bills? Why didn't he, do X, Y, and Z? Why didn't he finish school? It would have been all of that story. So that's what I wanted to unpack for people, that this is hidden and retold in ways that make it very hard to really understand.